The camera flashes were still going off behind his eyes when he poured the bourbon. That was the thing nobody told you about winning. How loud it was, and how completely the silence hit you the moment the crowd disappeared. The gala had ended 2 hours ago. The award was on his drafting table. Architect of the Year, etched in cold brass, heavy enough to feel significant, light enough to mean nothing at all the moment he set it down. Elias Voss pressed one hand flat against the floor-to-ceiling glass of his 41st floor studio and looked down at Chicago the way a man looks at something he built but cannot live inside. That was precisely the problem. He had designed 214 buildings across 11 countries. Hotels where strangers fell in love over scrambled eggs. Chapels where vows were pressed into stone he had shaped with his own hands. Ceremony terraces where proposals happened under string lights he had spec'd down to the exact wattage, warm white, 2700 Kelvin, the precise temperature of something that felt like forever. 18 years calculating the perfect conditions for love to happen. He had never once been foolish enough to stand inside them himself. Architect of the Year. The most celebrated builder of love in the country. Alone at midnight with bourbon he hadn't finished and a phone full of contacts who wanted something he could design, manage, or deliver. Not one of them, not a single soul, had ever called just to ask, "Are you okay?" Not the work. You. He set the glass down. He sat on the floor. Not in a chair, the floor. Back against the cold glass. Knees bent. The award somewhere behind him where he couldn't see it. This was the version of Elias Voss no camera had ever captured. The man who built other people's forever and came home to the suffocating silence of his own. His phone lit up on the drafting table. His assistant, 4 confetti emojis. His mother, 2 missed calls. A journalist from Architectural Digest wanting a quote about what winning meant to him. He turned the phone face down. Out of 214 buildings full of people whose best moments he had designed, there was not one person he could call just to say he was tired. He was the most celebrated architect in the country. He had not had a real conversation in 11 days. He picked up his phone and called a number he had never called before. He didn't search for it. He was sitting on the floor at 1:47 in the morning, phone face up in his hand, not scrolling with purpose, just holding the screen the way a drowning man holds something that might or might not float, when his thumb landed on it. Night work. Anonymous voice conversations for people who build things alone. Not a hotline. Not therapy. The tagline was plain. For architects, engineers, developers, designers, people who create for others and forget to live for themselves. You called. Someone answered. No names required. No record of the call. He pressed call before he had a reason to. He would tell himself later it was professional curiosity. He was still constructing that justification when the line connected. It rang twice. Then her voice. Not what he had braced for. Not warm in the performed customer service way he had prepared himself to deflect. Warm the way weathered timber is warm, something that had been through weather and kept its grain. Unhurried. Steady. Night work. I'm here. 3 words. He said nothing for 4 full seconds. A siren somewhere on Michigan Avenue. The low mechanical breath of the building's ventilation. All of it suddenly very far away. You don't have to start anywhere in particular, she said. Most people don't. Something in his chest. Something he had not registered as clenched, loosened. Not completely. Just enough. He pressed the back of his head against the glass and felt, for the first time in 11 days, like he did not have to perform anything for anyone. I won an award tonight, he said. How does it feel? He looked at the brass edge of the plaque on the drafting table. Like a blueprint, he said. Technically correct. Completely empty. She didn't rush to fix it. She let the sentence exist between them, the way a well-designed room lets sound exist, without swallowing it, without bouncing it back distorted. And in the holding, something in him that had been braced for deflection slowly put itself down. What did you build to win it? A wedding venue. Coast of Maine. 240 guests. A ceremony terrace that faces the water at golden hour. He paused. I flew to Portugal twice to source the altar stone. It sounds beautiful. It is. The silence that followed had shape to it. Wait, were you at the wedding? She asked quietly. He understood she didn't mean the building. No, he said. Have you ever been? He closed his eyes. No, quieter this time, as if the word had traveled a long way to reach the surface. She didn't say I'm sorry. She didn't say that must be lonely. She said, tell me what the limestone felt like. From the quarry in Portugal. His shoulders dropped. He closed his eyes and remembered. The dust on his palms, the weight of the stone, the afternoon light coming through at an angle that made everything look like it had already been ancient for 1,000 years before he arrived. He talked for 40 minutes. She listened like she had nowhere else to be, like he was the only structure in the world worth paying attention to. He called again the next night. He told himself it was the Sedona project, a resort complex, 17 buildings, a client who changed his mind about load-bearing walls the way other men changed their shirts. Purely practical. A professional using an available resource. She answered on the second ring. He talked about the Sedona client for exactly 4 minutes before she stopped him with a single question. What did you want to build, before you started building what other people wanted? He didn't answer for a long time. Then he did. The calls became the architecture of his weeks. The invisible load-bearing structure he built everything else around, the one that didn't appear on any drawing. Milwaukee. The back seat of his car. Gray January smear dissolving past tinted windows. 43 pages of structural reports unsigned on the seat beside him. Her voice through the speaker and the reports untouched for 40 minutes while he talked about what it felt like to design a building that would outlast everyone who had ever touched it. Then every building you finish is a kind of immortality, she said. The question is whether you're building it for them, or to prove something to yourself. He had not had a good answer. The server room. 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, sitting on the concrete floor between humming equipment racks. The only room in the building where no one would think to look for him. 43 employees. 6 city skylines. Millions of dollars of other people's futures moving through his decisions every week. And he was on a cold floor in the dark, talking to a woman whose last name he didn't know, about whether ambition and loneliness were the same wound wearing different clothes. Ambition, she said, is just loneliness that learned how to stay busy. He wrote it on a napkin. It was still in his coat pocket 3 weeks later. Zurich. A hotel gym at 5 a.m., the treadmill moving beneath him at the pace he used when his mind needed silencing, board presentation in 6 hours, design revision he wasn't sure was right, the low specific dread that had lived behind his sternum so long he'd stopped calling it dread and started calling it focus. Her voice came through his earbuds and his pace slowed without him deciding to slow it. He stepped off after 20 minutes and stood on the stationary belt. Just breathing. Through all of it, she was there, warm, unhurried, completely without agenda, softening the most airless corners of his world without ever trying to redesign them. He had never met anyone who asked for less and gave more. 6 weeks in, at 2 a.m., he told her about Marcus. He hadn't planned to. He'd been talking about a chapel in Vermont, a skylight he had obsessed over for 3 weeks, calculating the exact angle so morning light would fall on the altar at precisely 9 a.m. on a clear day. He stopped mid-sentence. I calculated that angle for 22 days, he said. I don't entirely know why I needed it to be perfect. She waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. My brother got married in a courthouse, he said. 12 people. Folding chairs. Fluorescent lights that hummed all the way through the vows. He paused. He asked me to design them something, a ceremony, a proper space. I told him I was too busy. He stopped. He died 8 months later. I-94, Black Ice, November. I never built him a single thing. The silence on the line was not empty. It was the fullest, most inhabited silence he had ever sat inside. You have been building it ever since, she said quietly. Every skylight, every altar, every angle of morning light. It's all for him. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. You cannot finish a building for someone who is already gone. But you can stop making every beautiful thing you create carry the weight of a debt it was never meant to pay. Marcus would not want to be the reason every skylight feels like an apology. Outside the window, Zurich was beginning to lighten at the edges. For the first time in 11 years, the weight behind his sternum shifted. Not disappeared, not resolved, just shifted. the way a load redistributes when a structure finally finds its right configuration. He exhaled, long, slow, all the way to the bottom. "Thank you," he said, smaller than he intended, more honest than he was used to. "Get some sleep, Elias." He did, but before he closed his eyes, one thought arrived and stayed. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know what she looked like, and she already knew him better than anyone alive. Thursday night, late February, the studio dark around him, a new project brief open on the screen. A client in coastal Georgia, private estate, ceremony pavilion, reception hall, guest cottages along a bluff above the Atlantic. The brief used the word romantic 14 times. He had counted. He had also spent 23 minutes staring at a blank sketchbook page before closing it and picking up his phone instead. He didn't wait for her to finish her opening line. "I want to meet you," he said. The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "Elias. Not for anything complicated. Coffee. 1 hour. You pick the place, the time, the exit." He stopped, reorganized, started again with something closer to the truth. "I have talked to you from 4 countries in 6 weeks. I have told you things I haven't said out loud in 11 years. I don't know your last name. I don't know what you look like." He paused. "And somehow you are the most real person in my life right now." The silence on her end was careful. Not cold careful. The way she was always careful with things that mattered. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said. "Why not?" She exhaled, not impatient, not dismissive. The exhale of someone measuring the weight of something before deciding how to carry it. "Because right now, in the dark on the phone, I can be exactly what these conversations need me to be. The moment you put a face to the voice, you'll start editing. Adjusting what you say based on what you see. A beat. What we have right now is structurally sound. I don't want to introduce a variable that compromises it." He almost smiled. "You're using my language. I've been listening to you for 6 weeks. Some of it was bound to absorb." He leaned back and looked at the ceiling, the exposed concrete, the pendant lighting, every surface he had designed with precision and inside which he now felt, for the first time, genuinely at home. Because of her voice, coming through a phone, from somewhere he couldn't locate on a map. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "Not the version of honest where you're protecting someone. The real kind. All right. Are you afraid I'll be disappointed?" The longest pause yet. Long enough that he heard her shift. A small sound, almost nothing. The sound of someone adjusting their weight under a question that landed harder than expected. "I'm afraid you'll be surprised," she said carefully, "when you see the woman sitting across from you, and that the surprise will quietly change something that has never once asked you to see it." "You want to know what I would actually see?" She didn't answer, which was, with her, always its own kind of answer. "Someone who asked me what the limestone felt like. Our very first call. Everyone else wanted to know what the building looked like, what it would photograph like, what it would be worth." He paused. "You wanted to know what it felt like in my hands. I have been designing things for 18 years. Quieter. You were the first person who ever asked me that." The line was very still. "Not yet, Elias." Soft, unhurried, and carrying underneath it something that sounded less like a closed door and more like one that had not yet decided whether it wanted to open. "Okay," he said. No pressure. No leveraging the resources of a man who could have found her address in 40 minutes. Just, okay. Steady. Without condition. He picked up his pencil. The sketchbook opened to a page that wanted to be filled. The bluff in coastal Georgia took shape beneath his hand. The pavilion, the ceremony terrace, the angle of water at golden hour. He drew for 2 hours without stopping, her voice still soft in his earpiece. He didn't know he was drawing her. He didn't know that every sight line, every threshold, every careful angle of morning light was being built for the woman on the other end of the phone. He was already designing her forever. He just didn't know it yet. And somewhere on the other end of that line, she did. The Harlow estate sat on a bluff above the Atlantic, 20 minutes outside Savannah. From the moment Elias stepped out of the car, he understood why the client had been so specific. Wild grass to the edge. weathered oaks older than anyone alive. The ocean so close you could taste the salt before you saw the water. That wide coastal Georgia light, honey gold, the kind that made everything it touched look like it was already a memory. His associate moved through the site with a measuring kit. His project manager was on a call by the car. Elias stood at the bluff's edge with his site notes untouched and looked at the water. He always thought about Marcus near water. He walked the perimeter alone, no phone, letting the land tell him what it wanted to become. The path curved behind the main house, past a caretaker's cottage, past a row of mature magnolias, and opened onto the rear lawn. There was a woman standing near the edge. She turned when she heard his footsteps. Polished, composed, dark blazer, silk blouse, the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to occupying important rooms. "Mr. Voss. I'm Claudette Harlow." He shook her hand. She was elegant and articulate and completely, definitively wrong. He understood that the same instant he registered it. Not cruelly, simply clearly. The way a builder knows within 60 seconds of a site visit whether the foundation is right. Everything she projected was surfaces. Immaculate, deliberate surfaces. Nothing underneath that sounded like what he knew. He excused himself after 4 minutes. He walked back toward the main house, his associate falling into step beside him with measurements and questions he answered on autopilot. They rounded the north side of the estate. The path curved downward, away from the main buildings, toward a small walled garden that had not appeared on any site plan he'd been sent. He almost walked past it. He didn't. The garden was enclosed by a low stone wall, overgrown at the edges, deliberately tended at the center. Someone's careful order living inside nature's deliberate wildness. A weathered wooden table. Papers held down against the coastal breeze by a coffee mug and a piece of driftwood. Site photographs pinned to a clipboard. A notebook filled margin to margin with handwriting too small to read from where he stood. And a woman sitting at the table with her back to him on the phone. Her voice moved through the salt air with a cadence that stopped him as completely as a wall. The way she let a sentence breathe before she finished it. The way she said yes, not as confirmation but as something warmer. Something that meant, "I am still here. I am still listening. You have my complete attention." He had heard that yes 41 times across 6 weeks and 4 countries. He had not realized until this moment that he had been counting. She was simply dressed. Dark trousers, plain cream blouse, hair pulled back with the carelessness of someone who had more important things to think about. Pencil marks on her left hand from the site photographs. Her dark hair had escaped whatever she'd pinned it with and was moving in the coastal breeze, and she had not noticed, or had noticed and decided it didn't matter. Her hands, when she reached for the clipboard, were the hands of someone who worked with them. Not manicured, marked with faint pencil lines and paper edges. There was a small scar along her left jawline, pale and faded, the kind that has been there long enough to become simply part of a face rather than a story about it. She looked like someone the world had been careless with. She looked like someone who had decided, quietly and without drama, to be careful with herself instead. Her voice drifted across the garden wall. One sentence. Nothing more. His associate said something beside him that he did not hear. The coastal light fell across the garden at exactly the angle he had been calculating for weeks. Honeygold, wide, landing on her like it had been specifically arranged. He stood at the entrance to the garden and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the foundation survey. He had spent 18 years designing the spaces where love was supposed to happen. He had just walked into one, and she was already inside it, on the phone, with someone else. She ended the call and reached for her coffee without looking up. Every professional instinct, he had said, walk away. Let the project manager make the connection at the scheduled meeting in 20 minutes. That was how he always did everything, correctly, precisely, through the right structural sequence. He said her name instead. Ren. She went completely still. The coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down with the slowness of someone whose body has understood something critical before the mind has finished processing it. Then she turned around. Dark eyes. The kind that didn't perform anything. They simply looked at you and registered exactly what they found. No social softening, no automatic adjustment. She looked at him the way she had always listened. He watched her face move through three things in the space of 4 seconds. Recognition, panic, something underneath both that looked, painfully, like grief. She was on her feet before he could speak, gathering papers with hands that were almost steady. Almost. Don't. One word. Not a command, the kind of plea that comes from somewhere below the ribcage, from the part of a person that has run out of energy to pretend. Please. Not right now. He took one step forward. He stopped himself there. They sat on the low stone wall at the garden's edge. The Atlantic moved beyond the bluff. The scheduled site meeting was in 17 minutes. Neither of them mentioned it. How long have you known? He asked. Since you described the bluff. She looked at her hands in her lap. The way the light comes in from the southeast at golden hour. You told me on a Thursday call 3 weeks ago. A pause. I designed this site 4 years ago. I know every degree of that light. I knew it was you before you filed the permit application. 3 weeks. She had known for 3 weeks. She had kept answering, kept calling. Let him describe the pavilion sightlines, the ceremony terrace, the altar placement. Let him ask her opinion on the angle of the morning light over the bluff, and said nothing. Given nothing away. Just kept showing up, warm and unhurried, while she sat on a truth that recontextualized every single word between them. He felt the armor begin to move. Not gently. What are you to this project? The temperature in his voice had changed. She heard it immediately. She had always heard everything immediately, which was precisely what made this so unbearable. Event coordinator. For years. Every event. Every layout. Every vendor. She paused. The pause had something heavy at the bottom of it. The ceremony this pavilion is being built for. She stopped. Looked at the stone wall. Started again. The bride is my younger sister, Camille. She gets married here in 8 weeks. The full weight of that landed without softening. Your firm was hired to build my sister's wedding venue, she said. And I spent 6 weeks on the phone in the dark telling you things I have never told another living person. Her voice held with the steadiness of someone spending enormous invisible effort to keep it that way. I didn't plan it. I found night work because I was drowning. I called because I needed to hear another person's voice. Someone who understood what it meant to build things for other people while quietly disappearing inside them. I didn't know it was you until it was already... She stopped. Until it was already the most important thing in my life. The accusation arrived before he could architect it into something measured. You let me keep designing it. The bitterness came from somewhere real. Somewhere the armor hadn't closed over in time. Every call for 3 weeks. I told you about the pavilion, the terrace, the threshold stone. I asked your opinion on the ceremony sightlines and you answered me. Ren. You gave me your opinion on a building you already knew was yours. I know. Was any of it real? The edge in his voice was not performed and could not be retracted. Or was I a convenience? A free consultation from the man building your family's most important day? Did you call because you needed me? Or because you needed the architect? She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the explanation that would have cleared her name in 30 seconds. The timeline, the permit filing date, the proof that she couldn't have known. All of it sitting right there. Available. Sufficient. She left every word of it untouched. A mirror, she said. I answered because the person you are in the dark, the man who sits on the floor of his own studio and cannot find a single person to call, is exactly who I was the night I found that line. Both of us have spent our entire lives building beautiful things for other people to live inside, while standing outside in the cold and calling it a career. The Atlantic moved. A slow wind came off the water. Those calls, she said. Her voice dropped to something he had never heard from her. Not the steady warmth he knew, but something underneath it. Something held carefully in reserve for a very long time. They were not just your oxygen, Elias. She looked at him directly. They were mine too. Every single night. He said nothing. The site meeting had started 4 minutes ago. Neither of them moved. And she still hadn't told him the one thing that could have ended all of it. The one thing that would have made him understand everything. She was still protecting him. He just didn't know it yet. She had 3 days. She spent all 3 of them working. On-site walkthroughs before the vendors arrived. Linen samples spread across the Harlow estate dining table like a fabric inventory of someone else's happiness. Camille called every morning with the luminous energy of a woman 8 weeks from the most important day of her life. Chair configurations, terrace stone, seating arrangements. Ren answered every question with a steadiness she did not feel anywhere beneath the surface. Elias had left the site meeting with complete professionalism. Reviewed the drawings. Asked the correct questions. Shaken the correct hands. He had not looked at her once. She had not called that night. He had not called either. The silence between them had acquired a shape, something with walls and a specific temperature. Not absence. Presence. The presence of everything unsaid accumulating weight in a space that used to be warm. She was in the estate's ground floor storage room on the 4th morning, cataloging imported table linens, when the door opened without a knock. She knew before she turned around. Richard Harlow crossed the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to announce himself anywhere. Silver-haired, precisely dressed. The stillness of someone who had learned that stillness itself is a form of power. He stopped at the work table and set his phone face up on the surface between them without a word. On the screen, a night work account log. Her account. 41 calls. The name on the receiving line, E. Voss. She did not look at his face. She needed 3 seconds to understand how far back this went. How long he had been watching, how carefully he had prepared, how completely she had already lost before she walked into this room. I have been aware of the nature of your communication with my son's wedding architect for some time, he said pleasantly. The pleasantness was the most frightening thing about him. A woman in your professional position conducting a private emotional relationship with the contracted designer of a project she is employed to manage. I wonder what the estate's board would make of that. Or the architectural firm's ethics committee. He tilted his head. The optics alone would be sufficient to end both careers. There was no conflict of interest. The calls predated the project assignment. I didn't know. It doesn't matter what you knew, he said simply. It matters what it looks like. He reached into his jacket. A photograph first. Camille and Ren outside the estate's main entrance, arms around each other, laughing. Beneath it, a document. A lease termination notice. Cedarview Assisted Living. Her mother's name at the top in clean black ink. A 30-day vacate order at the bottom. Richard Harlow's subsidiary property company listed as the owner. Ren had not known he owned it. She understood now, with cold precision, that he had always known she didn't know. That he had been holding it in reserve, quietly, patiently, for exactly this kind of morning. Your mother has been comfortable at Cedarview for 2 years, he said, with the tone of a man discussing a minor administrative matter. I would like her to remain comfortable. What I need is very simple. One call to Elias Voss, from the woman he trusts more than anyone in the world, suggesting his cultural center design has structural concerns serious enough to require his firm's withdrawal from the commission. The room was absolutely quiet. The Harlow family's competing bid proceeds without obstacle. Your mother's lease renewed 3 years, prepaid. And this, he gestured at the phone screen, disappears entirely. He straightened his cuffs. You have until Friday. 3 days, Ren. He walked to the door. I think we both know, he said without turning around, that you will make the right decision. The door closed with a soft, definitive click. She stood at the work table for a long time, the photograph of her and Camille face up on the surface. Her mother's name on the lease notice. The night work log underneath both of them, the foundation of everything Richard Harlow had built against her. Then her phone lit up on the shelf above the work table. Elias, calling. The screen glowed in the dim storage room, warm, patient, pulsing with the trust of a man who had handed her every unfinished and unguarded thing inside himself. Calling the way he always called, without performance, without condition. She looked at the lease notice. She looked at his name on the screen. If she made the call Richard wanted, she would take everything Elias had built across 18 years and use the most private parts of him as the instrument of his own destruction. Every skylight, every altar, Every angle of morning light calculated for Marcus. She would weaponize his grief. But if she didn't, her mother would be removed from the only safe place she had known in years. No legal recourse. No financial resource. No time. His name kept glowing. Trusting her with his life. One call to save her mother. One call to destroy the only man who had ever truly known her. With a trembling hand, Ren reached out. She did not make the call. She sat in the storage room for 2 hours after Richard Harlow left, the lease notice on the table in front of her. She thought about her mother, the way she looked on Sunday mornings at Cedarview, sitting by the window with a crossword and a cup of tea, more settled and more peaceful than Ren had seen her in 20 years. She thought about what relocation would cost. Not financially, what it would cost the part of her mother that had only recently, carefully, begun to feel safe. She thought about Elias. She did not make the call. What happened instead came from a direction she had not anticipated and could not have prevented. By Thursday morning, the story was already moving through the architectural press. A source inside Voss Architectural, someone positioned quietly, months in advance, long before Richard Harlow ever walked into a storage room with a phone screen and a lease notice, had delivered a selectively edited recording to 2 industry journalists. An internal project meeting. Elias's voice, stripped of context, rearranged into something that looked exactly like a conflict of interest in the Cultural Center Commission. By Thursday afternoon, 3 outlets had published it. By Thursday evening, his firm's legal team was fielding calls from the licensing board. Richard had never needed her to make the call. He had needed her occupied, silent, watching from the wrong direction while he used a different instrument entirely. She had been the decoy from the beginning, positioned perfectly to believe she held the decision, while the real mechanism moved invisibly behind her. She understood that now. It did not make the damage any different. Elias arrived at the Harlow estate at 7 a.m. on Friday. Not for the project. He walked the path to the garden without needing to be directed. The particular grim momentum of a man who has one remaining thing to do before everything else collapses. She was already there, sitting on the stone wall where they had sat 9 days ago, hands folded in her lap, not pretending to work. The coastal light was thin and early and fell across the garden without warmth. He stood at the entrance and looked at her. When he spoke, his voice was level, precise, completely without temperature, the voice of a man who has placed every feeling behind load-bearing glass so it cannot move or damage anything on its way out. I opened every dark and unfinished room of myself for you, he said. Marcus, the courthouse, the fluorescent lights, every piece of it. I handed it to you and you held it, and I believed that was real. He paused. I need to know if you gave Harlow what he needed to build that recording. A detail, a date, anything. She looked at him. This was the moment. 30 seconds of honest words. The storage room, the photograph, the lease notice, the call she never made, the permit timeline that proved she couldn't have known. All of it sitting right there. Precise. Available. Sufficient. She looked into his eyes. And stopped. He was not broken. He was ignited. The cold in his voice was not the cold of a man collapsing. It was the cold of a man who has located something worth fighting for and is already calculating how to fight it. If she cleared her name right now, he would turn that fire directly toward Richard Harlow. And Richard Harlow, who had spent months constructing this, who had journalists and board members and a criminal defense attorney already on retainer, would dismantle him piece by piece. The commission. The firm's reputation. 18 years of work. Every skylight. Every altar. Every building that carried Marcus inside it without saying so. He needed to believe she had failed him. His anger was the only armor that would carry him through what was coming without losing everything in the process. She made the calculation in 4 seconds. She would hate herself for every one of them for a very long time. If believing that I betrayed you, she said, her voice absolutely steady, the steadiest it had ever been, which was the hardest thing she had ever done, gives you the fury you need to fight back and survive this, then you need to believe it. She watched something move behind his eyes. A question. The beginning of a different understanding reaching toward the surface. Then the glass came down. Fully. Completely. The armor she had spent 6 weeks learning the precise shape of, reassembling itself in real time. She felt the loss of it the way you feel the loss of a load-bearing wall. Everything the structure was holding suddenly redistributed into empty air. He turned without another word. She watched him walk back down the gravel path, shoulders straight, pace measured, carrying his fury like a set of drawings for something he intended to build the moment he got back to his studio. She watched him until the path curved behind the magnolias and he was gone. Then she reached out and pulled the garden gate closed between them. Slowly, with both hands. She stood on her side of it in the thin morning light, fingers still wrapped around the cold iron latch, and listened to the Atlantic moving beyond the bluff. The same water, the same salt air, the same wide coastal light he had been calculating sight lines around for months. The gate was closed. She had closed it herself. She stood in the garden he had designed around her without knowing it, in the space he had built for her sisters forever, and understood that some structures are load-bearing in ways that never appear on any drawing. The ones you build to hold someone else up, even when it costs you everything underneath. She filed everything on a Monday morning. Not anonymously. Not through a lawyer who would have kept her name clean and her wounds private. She walked into the Georgia State Contractor Licensing Board at 9 a.m. with a folder that had taken her 14 days to build. Richard Harlow's subsidiary ownership of Cedarview, the manufactured source inside Voss Architectural, the selectively edited recording alongside the original unedited version she had pulled from the estate's internal server logs, the storage room lease notice with her mother's name on it, and a signed personal statement describing in precise and unflinching detail every word of every conversation that had taken place between herself and Richard Harlow. She included the night work call log, her own account, all 41 entries. She included the part about herself, the drowning, the dark, the 2 a.m. calls, all of it, because Richard Harlow had built his entire case on the assumption that she would guard her privacy more ferociously than she would guard the truth. He had spent months calculating the exact dimensions of her silence. He had miscalculated what 6 weeks of honest conversation in the dark had quietly rebuilt inside her. The specific courage of a woman who has finally been completely known and discovered she could survive it. By Wednesday, the press narrative had reversed entirely. By Thursday, Richard Harlow had withdrawn from the commission bid and retained a criminal defense attorney. By Friday, the Harlow Estate Board had accepted his resignation with a terse 2-sentence statement that said everything by saying almost nothing. He did not make a statement. He did not appear publicly. He simply disappeared into the machinery of consequence the way men like Richard Harlow always eventually do, quietly, expensively, and far too late for the people who had already paid the price of his ambition. The architectural press ran the correction with considerably less prominence than they had run the original story. Justice, when it finally arrived, was real. It was just quieter than the damage had been. The commission was reinstated to Voss Architectural. Camille's wedding remained on schedule. The pavilion continued to be built. Wren was not there to see any of it. Elias drove 4 hours from Chicago on a Saturday morning without telling anyone where he was going. He walked to the estate coordinator's cottage at something close to running, hammered on the door until his knuckles ached, stood back breathing hard while the sound of his own knocking dissolved into silence. The cottage was empty, her site photographs gone from the corkboard, her drafting pins, her clipboard, her margin-filled notebooks gone. The corkboard bare in the particular way of a surface carefully cleared rather than simply abandoned. She had taken everything, left nothing accidental behind. The only object remaining in the entire cottage was a single envelope on the stone windowsill above the kitchen basin. His name on the front. Her handwriting, the same he recognized from 4 years of her site plan margin notes. He sat down on the floor, back against the cold stone wall, knees bent, envelope in both hands. He had been here before, a different floor, a different city, the same posture of a man who has run out of scaffolding. He opened it. Elias, 7 years ago I stood on the Talmadge Bridge at 2 a.m. in January with the black water moving 40 feet below me. I had spent 4 years married to a man who had taken everything I understood myself to be and replaced it, carefully and systematically, with a smaller and more manageable version. When I finally left, I didn't know what was waiting on the other side of leaving. I wasn't entirely certain there was anything. Right before I let go, a notification lit up my phone. A live-streamed industry talk. A man I had never heard of, speaking the night his firm won the Chicago Waterfront Commission. The title stopped me. On building things that outlast you. You said, the most important structure you will ever design is not the one that gets photographed or published or awarded. It is the one that makes a single person feel, for the first time, that they are allowed to take up space in the world. I stood on that bridge in January and I listened to you say that. And I came back from the edge. I did not know your name for 2 years after that night. I found Nightwork when I learned you had built it, quietly funded, for people who create in isolation and forget they are allowed to need something in return. I called because I was drowning again. A different kind of drowning. I needed the voice of someone who understood what it meant to build beauty for other people while standing outside it in the cold. I did not know it was you on the other end of the line until it was already the most important thing in my life. By then the Georgia permit had been filed and your name was on it, and I understood that the man who had pulled me off a bridge with 11 words was now building my sister's wedding venue, and was calling me every night from hotel gyms and server rooms in the back seats of cars, and was telling me about Marcus. I stayed silent for 3 weeks because I did not know how to hand you the full circle without it looking like something it was not. I know now that the silence was its own kind of damage. I am sorry for it. It was the one dishonest thing I did across 41 calls, and I will carry it. What I did in that licensing board office, the statement, the call logs, every wound laid out in plain language for strangers to read, was not courage. It was the only honest thing left available to me. You told me once on a Thursday call that the only structures worth putting your name on are the ones you would stand behind without flinching. I put my name on this one. The bridge goes both ways, Elias. You pulled me back 7 years ago with 11 words you never knew anyone heard. 41 calls across 6 weeks was simply my way of returning the lifeline. Everything else, what it became, what it cost, what it was, I think you already know. Ren. He sat on the floor of the empty cottage for a long time. The coastal light moved through the window above him and crossed the stone floor slowly, the way light crosses a space that has been designed to receive it. Then he stood up. The commission was formally reinstated on a Wednesday morning. Elias was not in the office when the confirmation arrived. He was at a cemetery in suburban Milwaukee, standing in front of a headstone he had visited exactly twice in 11 years. Once the week Marcus died, once the week after. Nothing in his hands. Nothing prepared to say. He stood there for 40 minutes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He went back to Chicago and opened his sketchbook to a blank page. Not to produce anything, not to solve anything, not to deliver anything to anyone. He drew the garden, the low stone wall, the wooden table, the driftwood holding down papers in the coastal breeze. From memory, with the precision of a man who had been calculating its dimensions without realizing it for months. He drew it small, in the center of the page, with a lot of space around it. It was the first thing he had ever drawn with no client, no brief, no deadline, no structural requirement of any kind except the one that mattered, that it was true. Ren took a position with a nonprofit in Savannah the week the licensing board filing closed. A former textile warehouse on the east side, abandoned 11 years, full of the dignified decay of a building that had been useful once and remembered it. The work paid very little. It was the first project in 4 years that felt entirely like hers. She started with the garden at the back. Early mornings, hands in the soil, planting things that would take time to become what they were supposed to be. She was not in a hurry. She had learned, across 14 days of building a licensing board folder at her kitchen table, that the most important structures are the ones you build slowly and put your name on without flinching. The exhaustion that had lived in her face, since the bridge, since the marriage, since the years of building other people's forever while standing outside in the cold, had begun, slowly and without announcement, to lift. She looked like someone who had finally come inside. He found her 6 weeks later through the work. Her name on a permit. Former textile warehouse, Savannah's east side. He drove down on a Tuesday morning in April without announcing himself, parked 2 streets away, walked the rest on foot. She was in the small walled garden behind the warehouse, kneeling in the soil with her hands in the dirt, her back to him. hair down, old work clothes, completely unhurried. She looked like someone who had nowhere else to be and had made peace with that. He placed the envelope on the stone gate post before she heard him. Inside it, the original napkin from the server room in Chicago. Her words in his handwriting. Ambition is just loneliness that learned how to stay busy. Slightly creased from weeks in a coat pocket. Beneath it, a single index card written that morning in the car. I think I am finally ready to stop being busy. If you'll show me how. She stilled. The garden went quiet around her. She looked at the envelope. She looked at what was inside it. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and was very still, the way a structure is still in the seconds after the last load settles and everything finds its level. Then she looked up. He stood at the gate in a plain jacket, no tie, hands loose at his sides. None of the scaffolding. None of the drafting table precision. None of the architecture of a man performing his own significance. Just Elias. The 2 a.m. version. The floor version. The version that existed when there was no one watching and nothing left to perform. Hello, he said. I am Elias. I have spent 18 years designing spaces where people are supposed to fall in love. The coastal morning light moved through the garden the way he had always calculated light. From the southeast at an angle, landing on everything it touched like it had been specifically arranged. I would very much like to try standing inside one. If you'll have me. She looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. Then Ren smiled. Not the careful professional warmth she wore in site meetings. Not the quiet steadiness he had learned to hear through a phone line at 2 a.m. Something that reached all the way to the back of her dark eyes and settled there. Open, unguarded, without architecture of any kind. The smile of a woman who has stopped building walls around the things she is allowed to want. She moved over in the dirt. He came through the gate, and they knelt together in the garden of a building that had been empty for years. Two people who had spent their entire lives designing things for other people to live inside, and began, with their hands in the same soil, to build something with no client, no brief, no deadline, and no one's name on it but their own. True love is not designing the perfect space for someone else's forever. It is finally, imperfectly, having the courage to walk through the gate you built, and stay inside it this time.